Let's think about the Teachers College in our hearts and minds, which touches every corner of the world every day. What is Teachers College? It's the epicenter of education, health, and psychology. It is nearly every school system, community health program, and multicultural counseling program in the United States and beyond. But it's also a coffee cart on West 120th Street. It's a speeding number 1 train. It's the early morning sunlight over Morningside Park. And at this uncertain moment, it's a way of being in a complicated world. Teachers College is the stuff that dreams are made of. It is a canvas on which each successive generation paints its murals. It's a universal library where we add our collective masterworks. It's a mixing board to lay down our tracks alongside the greats. Teachers College is Harlem, where we work with educators learning the neighborhood's proud history and legacy of resourcefulness and indomitable will. TC is America's community colleges, which are a gateway for underserved populations. And TC is also indelibly New York City, where we are helping schools transition to online education, bringing critically needed medical equipment to major hospitals, and providing psychological services, even as the current crisis touches us personally. But Teachers College is also Bangladesh and Lebanon. TC is Ecuador and Peru. It's Ghana and Cambodia and Bolivia. It's China and it's Europe. On almost every continent, we find TC, creating and improving schools, bringing physics to young people worldwide through hip-hop pedagogy, giving displaced people new hope, working with indigenous populations to preserve their own languages, helping children with cleft palate reclaim their lives, empowering children with autism to utter their first words. All of these people, states, and countries are Teachers College, as are all the places our students call home. It's everywhere that our graduates are shaping a healthier, better educated, more equitable, and more joyful world. TC is in our hearts and minds, as well as in every corner of the world.
Good evening. I'm Stephanie Rowley, Provost of Teachers College. I hope you're enjoying the symposium. We're so honored to have the Arnhold Institute based at Teachers College and proud that the first symposium focuses on access and equity issues. In the next segment, we celebrate the exceptional Teachers College alumna, Beryl McBurnie. Traveling from her home in Trinidad in 1938, McBurnie undoubtedly understood the opportunities that Teachers College and its surrounding Harlem arts community had to offer. But McBurnie also knew how to make waves. As a dancer, researcher, choreographer, and teacher, she revived and preserved Trinidad's folk and indigenous dances. In contributing this knowledge, she made a lasting impact on dance and dance education here in the U.S. and across the Caribbean. Historically, her work is an impressive example of early artistic scholarship in a still nascent field. As our first 2 guest speakers have demonstrated, the intellectual and creative contributions of Black, Indigenous, African, and African American artists have formed the very bedrock of American dance, regardless of the systemic racism that worked to oppress their voices. Teachers College celebrates Beryl McBurnie's pioneering vision. We're proud of her life's work and indebted to her extraordinary legacy. Our next speaker, Judy Raymond, will transport you back in time to Beryl McBurnie's world. There you'll capture a glimpse of this iconoclastic and endearing Teachers College pioneer. Judy Raymond is a journalist and writer who joins us from Trinidad, where she's the editor-in-chief of Newsday Trinidad and Tobago. Educated at Oxford and the University of London, Ms. Raymond has written extensively about the arts, artists, and writers, and has maintained a long-running parliamentary column. She's the author of 4 books. Her biography of Beryl McBurnie, our topic tonight, was a finalist in the autobiography memoir category of the 2019 International Book Awards and has been adopted for the Caribbean Civilization course at all 3 campuses of the University of the West Indies. On behalf of Teachers College, I give a warm welcome to Judy Raymond.
Let's begin by looking at Beryl McBurney literally, and at the same time, judging a book by its cover. The Portrait of the Young McBurney by Carl van Vechten. It may suggest a new way of looking at McBurney's life and different answers to some questions about her years in New York City in the 1930s and 40s. This is the best portrait of the young McBurney that I know of, because of the busyness of the patterned wallpaper behind her, a favorite trick of the photographers, the bright colors of her beads, her hair being pulled back. The viewer's eyes are drawn to the stillness of the subject's face. And because Beryl's own piercing, hypnotic eyes are looking away from the camera, the viewer can focus on her face. It's both a portrait of Beryl McBurney, the dancer, Belle Rosette, as she was known then, a very Creole name that meant beautiful little rose, and of Beryl the person. But her expression in this image is uncharacteristic of photos of her. Unlike much of what she did, you feel this is a collaboration between 2 artists, the subject and the photographer. He's got her absolutely right, self-possessed, dramatic, not classically beautiful, but strong-featured. What she's wearing is typical of her. She's dressed in an eye-catching, improvised way. The caption of the photo describes this as an African costume, though that may actually mean it uses part of a Trinidad carnival costume from an African-themed masquerade band. She's young, 28, but clearly a fully formed personality. She doesn't feel the need to wear makeup, and her set lips and square, determined jaw show she had no interest in whether she matched anyone else's idea of prettiness. This photo of McBurney, along with several others, was taken by Carl van Vechten on July the 31st, 1941. Van Vechten was a hugely important figure at the time and had been for perhaps 2 decades in the cultural life of New York and especially of Harlem. As well as being a photographer, he was a critic of music, art, drama, and literature, a journalist and a novelist. A biography of him is titled The Tastemaker. He helped launch the careers of Langston Hughes and Paul Robeson. He was close to Zora Neale Hurston. The Jamaican-born poet Claude Mackay was another of his friends or protégés. Nathan Irving Huggins, author of what is probably the definitive book on the Harlem Renaissance, wrote that Van Vechten was, of all the whites to become associated with Black Harlem in the 1920s, the undisputed prince. He had the reputation of knowing Harlem intimately, not only the places of entertainment, but also the important people. He almost made a career of promoting, socially and professionally, Negro artists and performers. So for Carl van Vechten to want to photograph Beryl McBurney was a sign that 3 years after landing in New York, she had definitely arrived. When he took this photo in 1941, she was at the very beginning of her brief years as a professional performer in the city. It's tempting to wonder whether he helped set her on her upward path or introduced her to his artistic friends, though it's also hard to imagine the very proper Miss McBurney attending the kind of wild parties that Van Vechten favored. There are a few possible known connections between them. Van Vechten was friends with and later photographed the Trinidadian writer and political thinker C.L.R. James, who came to New York in 1938, the same year as McBurney. They had been friends in Trinidad before James left for England in 1932, and it is said they were lovers. Paul Robeson had known Van Vechten since 1925, and while she was in New York City, McBurney formed a friendship with Robeson, so deep and durable that he opened her little theater when he visited Trinidad in 1948. So Van Vechten is important in that he links McBurney, directly or indirectly, with many other prominent figures in the arts, both black and white. And yet, and this is absolutely frustratingly typical of Beryl McBurney's life, we don't know yet how they came to meet. Van Vechten's photo also makes another connection. By the time McBurney arrived in Harlem, where, at least for a while, she lived in a tiny studio apartment, officially the Harlem Renaissance was over, although its influence would have lingered in terms of attracting Black artists of all kinds, having raised their profile and prestige, so that Harlem was still a center of Black culture. Also, as Huggins writes, for all, Black and white, New York was the occasion for breaking away from small-town life, the restrictions of family control, and for growing up. This would have been especially true for McBurney, a young woman coming from a small, and though creative, in many ways conservative island. Trinidad, for a middle-class girl from Port of Spain in her day, would have been even more confined. She would have been expected to remain within certain respectable parts of the city. The suburb in which she lived, Woodbrook, was built for middle-class Creole people, that is, mostly of mixed African and European descent. Her education, both in and out of school, would have included music and dance. She would have had piano and dance lessons, learning to play and perform classical pieces and waltzes and foxtrots in readiness for tea dances with suitable young men. She took to dance very early, performing European-style dances at a concert she staged at home at the age of 7 or 8. Later, she not only danced and choreographed, but also wrote songs and music. This formal musical foundation made her a typical child of Woodbrook, which produced a number of notable musicians, such as Ellie Manette of the Invaders Steel Band, which for a time was the house band at Beryl's Little Carib Theatre. As for what formed her forceful, independent, some might say headstrong personality, there are several contradictory stories about McBurney's father, but most likely she was brought up in a household headed by her mother. Beryl and her sister would have been expected to earn their living. She became a teacher, fitting this in with her unofficial work of dance teaching and performing with the company she created. Meanwhile, in Trinidad, other women were likewise forging their own paths, and in fact all around the Caribbean, without the benefit in those days of any formal women's movement. They just did it in music, politics, social work, fine art, and many other fields. So all in all, New York City, with its energy, its mix of peoples and cultures from all over the world, its air of modernity, was a natural fit for a Trinidadian. McBurney would also have shared feelings and ideas with the artists who had made up the Harlem Renaissance and their successors. Huggins comments, "It was commonly thought in those decades around World War I that culture, literature, art, music, etc., was the true measure of civilization. Certainly that's an idea that McBurney would have agreed with, and she would have been in harmony with a movement that sought to include arts of African origin as part of that culture." But Huggins also comments, with notable exceptions like Langston Hughes, most Harlem intellectuals aspired to high culture as opposed to that of the common man. This was an attitude of cultural elitism. There, McBurney would have parted ways with them. Van Vechten's images illustrate one of her two utterly different lives. McBurney's art was serious, but it was rooted in folk art, in living traditions, performed and evolved at funerals in the villages of Trinidad, Orisha feasts in the hills of Laventille, vendors' cries in the leafy Port of Spain suburb of St. Clair, or the markets of Tunapuna or San Juan. McBurney differed from African-American artists in other important ways too. As a Trinidadian, a West Indian, she came from a place where the majority of the population were people of color. There was still prejudice and discrimination against them, and they were second-class citizens of the British Empire. But they had been emancipated for almost a century, and Beryl's unshakable self-confidence came partly from this and from her middle-class status, which was enhanced not only by her education, but also by her complexion. Before emancipation, the free colored people of Trinidad had occupied an intermediate legal status between black and white. This led to the shadeism of the West Indies. The rule was that if you were light-skinned, you were of higher social status than if you were black. And in Trinidad, McBurnie would never have been described as black. She was red or possibly brown. So many of the problems faced by African Americans must have been quite new to her. Some she would simply not have noticed, assuming that she was at least the equal of anyone she met and would be treated as such. Sometimes this would have made her life in New York easier, while at other times she would have been shocked at the formal and informal racial barriers that she would have encountered. As for Black dance theatre, considered as an art, that was starting to get off the ground in the US when Beryl arrived. The American Negro Ballet had been formed, but lasted in that incarnation only a few months. It had been dissolved by the time McBurnie arrived, though it was resurrected as the American Swing Ballet. McBurnie was not interested, however, in anything that could be described as ballet. Nevertheless, the fact is, any Black dancer who worked in that period in unearthing, preserving, and performing pieces of African origin was inescapably engaged in a political act. But for Beryl McBurnie, the work of African American dancers was not her work. So, what were McBurnie's intentions? She arrived in New York in 1938 and left for the last time in 1945. But she gave different accounts of why she first came to the city: to study medicine, which she said was what her family wanted, or to study dance, or to see her sick father. It seems unlikely that, knowing Beryl, her family would have tried to make her do anything. She was already 25 when she arrived in New York, and talking about that time, decades later, she said simply, "I must always do what I want to do." The conventional wisdom is that she went to New York to study dance, that she could have been a major star on Broadway, but that she followed her original intention of coming home and giving local folk dance its rightful place through a company based in the theatre she was building herself. But in fact, when you look at what she actually did in those years, it's not at all clear what she wanted to do or whether it really constituted a plan. McBurnie was never a full-time student in the US, and her studies did not all involve dance. She took summer sessions in 1938 at Columbia Teachers College in rhythms for children, play production, and painting and drawing. In 1940, she did eurythmics and also dance composition and modern technique, both of the latter under Martha Graham. The only other tuition she had at Columbia was in 1945, when she did 3 summer courses in voice and diction, accompaniment for dance, and stagecraft. She had also briefly learned modern dance technique under Charles Weidman. She did courses in black and white art and watercolor. In 1945, she said, she also had private tuition from an opera singer and actor in Shakespeare. McBurnie also did some teaching, sometimes of West Indian dance. She met and taught Pearl Primus, and she later claimed to have taught Catherine Dunham. There are a number of possible reasons why McBurnie didn't devote more time to study in New York. Even before she sailed for the US, as a teacher in Trinidad, she would probably have been given a fairly solid basis in dance education, as it was in those days. And the content of what she taught or wanted to teach was to be found in Trinidad and elsewhere in the Caribbean. Also, although McBurney was an intelligent and thoughtful woman, she was an artist, not an academic. She didn't think in straight lines, but worked intuitively and impulsively. Her years in New York and her time at Columbia equipped her with some practical training, a theoretical basis for her work, and also some experience in teaching. But unlike Primus and Dunham, she was not cut out for the academic life. Her perennial restlessness and her short attention span may have been another factor in the repeated journeys home or in her unexpected pivot in New York towards performing rather than focusing on training to teach dance. Looking back now at the direction her career eventually took, it's a pity that she didn't acquire more academic discipline. She might have left a record of her choreography, her research methods, her aims for her Little Carib Theatre and its dance company, even if they were never realized. But like many Trinidadians, she was an individualist, and many incidents over the years made it clear that for all her charm, McBurney did not play well with others. It's impossible to imagine her fitting into any kind of theatre company except as the head of it. It was always a struggle as a result to keep her Little Carib company going, partly because teamwork and a collaborative style of leadership was simply beyond her. McBurney may have felt then, rightly or wrongly, that formal training in one of the many approaches to dance taught in New York might detract from, rather than add to, her recreations and performances of traditional dance, or that she didn't need it, or, quite possibly, she just didn't enjoy it. One curious fact that should be examined more closely is that McBurney traveled back to and from Trinidad several times in those 7 years, for reasons she never explained, even though World War II had begun in 1939, and the voyage was therefore a dangerous one. She didn't get a degree in the US. Perhaps she never meant to. Perhaps she never meant to spend as long as she did in the city. It may be that she intended to go home sooner, but was drawn back again and again by the glamour and freedom of big city life, the possibility of real stardom, and also having found a ready-made community of fellow artists, including dancers, some of them West Indians. Then too, McBurney enjoyed performing, and the US, in turn, enjoyed her. She was vivacious, funny, charismatic, flamboyant, but her work was not mere entertainment. She was not prepared to adapt it to the fashions of the times or of other places, and she would have been outraged at being considered some sort of exotic novelty act, which may have been how she was in danger of being regarded in the US at one time. Look at some of the things that her contemporaries Josephine Baker and Carmen Miranda had to resort to make their names. Nevertheless, her stunning success as a performer seems to have been one reason why, sometime between 1940 and 1941, McBurney stopped studying completely until 1945. She began to appear at leading venues, at first in Harlem and later elsewhere in New York City and around the country. She begins to appear in revues in 1941, after her earliest performances. An account of her appearance as a supporting act to a Brazilian singer raves about Belle Rosette, a slender bronze girl in a flowing and colorful Shango costume, an infectious grin lighting her gamin face. She poised there on her toes for a split second, and then, at the first beat of the drums, Belle Rosette executed the first sinuous and sensuous moves of the Shango, a dance she brought with her from her native Trinidad. Excitement was high. No longer was the audience nice and polite and remote. It completely lost its face and became rowdy in paying obeisance to this girl from Trinidad who completely stole the show from the star. When it quietened down after a third encore, she sang a calypso song about the Germans surrendering to the British. She was no longer a dancer, but a minx kidding the life out of the Axis dictators. She waved a newspaper high in the air, crying, "Argos paper, latest telegram, German surrender under the British command." It's obvious from this and other reviews that McBurney always had a very clear idea of exactly who she was as a performer, choreographer, and writer. What she performed was the material she had always loved and made her own. Luckily, her American audiences liked it too, even if they didn't always understand all her references. When Beryl had a hit with that act, for instance, the US had not yet even joined the war. A Caribbean program, staged at the Brooklyn Academy of Music at the end of that year, demonstrates McBurney's refusal to tailor her repertoire to her audience. Belle Rosette was the headline act this time, along with a Haitian Marder group. She performed The Obeah Woman, Necromancy of the West Indies, then a Barraquite dance from the Trinidad Carnival of olden days, and Shango, voodoo ritual practiced by descendants of Africans in Trinidad. She appeared in street scenes of Trinidad with the Haitians, then sang Calypso news, performed Whoopsin, modern Calypso dance with the Haitians, and sang another Calypso classic, Ugly Woman. She also sang folk songs of the islands, several songs in French patois from St. Lucia, Martinique, and Dominica, and did a Martinican dance. The grand finale was Shouters from Sobo, described as singing and dancing of the Shouter sect. The piece that McBurney called Shango was based on the rituals and beliefs of the faith also then referred to as Shango, from the name of the god of thunder, most powerful deity in the Orisha pantheon. The Orisha faith itself, an African-European syncretic folk religion that had originated with the Yoruba people, spread throughout the New World, becoming Santeria in Cuba and Voodoo in Haiti. Wherever it's found, this faith incorporates dance and drumming and spirit possession. Each Orisha power, or Loa, or deity, has his or her own characteristic movements, which are how other devotees recognize which power has possessed or mounted a worshipper as they dance. It has been practiced in Trinidad for centuries, but was practiced secretly for many years because it was wrongly conflated with obeah, thought of as black magic or witchcraft, which was then illegal. It's astonishing, but also absolutely characteristic, that McBurney would recognize its significance to Trinidad dance. But by the time she arrived in New York, McBurney had been researching local dance for at least 5 years. In 1933, aged 20, she happened to meet the folklorist Andrew Carr on Bellow Road in Belmont, an area of eastern Port of Spain once known as Freetown. It was thus named because it had been settled by Africans 100 years before and more. These were people who had recently been emancipated, many born in Africa and not enslaved for long, and many others who had never spent time in enslavement, but were liberated by the British Navy from foreign slave ships after the British abolished the slave trade in 1807. In other words, Belmont was a part of Trinidad, right in the middle of the capital city, where the spirit of Africa was alive and well and had deep roots. Andrew Carr was able to arrange for McBurney to meet his mother, who knew a lot about the Rada cult, a group who had been settled in the area for close to a century, and on whose compound in Belmont, the cult of the snake god Dangwe of Dahomey or Benin was and still is practiced. All of that illustrates some important points about Trinidad and hence about McBurney. The significance of dance to enslaved people was recognized very early and commented on by European observers, including sugar plantation owners, who wrote about the West Indies in the 19th century. Some were baffled by its importance. Some connected it with witchcraft. Many feared it might help foment insurrection. A few enjoyed and admired it. The Caribbean islands, tiny as they are, were not always economically and politically insignificant. Many were once hugely valuable colonies that satisfied the vast European appetite for sugar. The first peoples who inhabited them had been wiped out by enslavement and genocide, or had fled. The European powers that colonized the Caribbean turned to Africa as a source of labor for the cane fields, and so began the Atlantic slave trade. Every West Indian island has its own history, culture, accent, and ideas about itself, although they also have a great deal in common. But Trinidad wasn't a classic slave society, or one of the rich islands that was fought over by the French, Dutch, Danes, Spanish, and British. But as a result, dance had a particular strength and significance in Trinidad, because slavery had never existed here on a large scale or for a long period. African dance came directly, undiluted, from the source. It was one of the main aspects of their culture that African people were able to bring to the Caribbean, and they were able to do so because it was portable, intangible, and teachable. All you needed was a drum or something that could be used as a drum. For the dancers, it was a liberating and unifying force. It was a way to hold on to one's own ancestral traditions and to create dances that also drew on the dances and the music of different African peoples and of the European colonizers, such as the ballet. But it's also important to understand that in McBurnie's early years, despite her love for them, these works, based on African traditions, were looked down upon in Trinidad, which remained a British colony. C.L.R. James, 12 years older than Beryl, wrote of being brought up as a Black Englishman. Working to change these attitudes was a huge undertaking. As the island became more anglicized in the course of the 19th century, the folk traditions of the peoples who were brought here as laborers were scorned and thrown aside in favor of the proper British way of doing things. McBurnie complained about school children being taught to do the Highland fling, or opera being sung rather than calypso. As late as 1963, she was still having to ask, are we afraid because most of the vital expression of our folk material is of African origin? McBurnie wasn't afraid. She and like-minded thinkers were pioneers in recognizing the strength and the importance of the African cultural retentions of the island and of the region. They included those who were working for the political self-determination and independence of the country, her friends, such as the historian and future Prime Minister, Dr. Eric Williams, the journalist and politician Albert Gomes, and of course, though he spent much of his life overseas, C.L.R. James. Many of the folk traditions of Trinidad had been driven underground, but some, like Carnival, couldn't be suppressed, or not for long. As well as the genteel piano lessons and ballet classes, there were riotous carnival characters, bad behavior sailors, the stilt-walking Moko Jumbies, the jab-jabs, experts with whips, the molasses-smeared devils who would intimidate bystanders into giving them cash, Dame Lorraine, men dressed as caricatures of women. To find, to learn, and to retain these and other customs, McBurnie went out into the countryside at night, to Shango ceremonies, to bongo dances honoring the dead. She went to nearby St. James, then a village mainly occupied by people of Indian descent, for Hosei, a yearly Shia Muslim commemoration that involves nightly processions accompanied by tassa drumming and a ceremony known as Dancing the Moons. It would have been frowned on for a respectable Christian Creole girl to go to such places almost a century ago. But Beryl's individualism, her refusal to accept the rules, to do what was expected of her, is a national characteristic. Although few women of her time would also have had the persistence and strength of will to build a theatre in their mother's backyard over the repeated protests of the city council, and then run a dance company there for many years. And it remains a mystery that, given a chance of freedom and success in the metropolis, either as a teacher or as a famous singer and dancer, this young woman from a tiny island chose to return here for good. We can only speculate. She loved her country and its people, and the source of her material, the wellspring of her passion, were in the Caribbean, even in the United States, as we've seen. That is what she choreographed and performed, either solo or with the troupe she formed there. McBurnie's age may also have told against her. By the time she left New York, finally, she was in her 30s. And then, too, the quest for novelty might soon have moved on in search of newer, younger dancers, or fashions for which she was not prepared to compromise. All or none of these may form part of the truth, which is a complex and elusive thing even when you think you're dealing with facts and writing nonfiction. I said earlier that McBurnie's behavior in her New York years doesn't suggest, for all her determination and her strength of character, that she had a plan. And sometimes the patterns of our lives seem to be set for us in our very early years. Perhaps McBurnie's destiny was actually decided on the day when, aged 7 or 8, she performed 2 dances in a concert that she organized and produced in her mother's back garden. The name Beryl McBurnie is still universally, if somewhat vaguely, known in Trinidad. Not everyone here knows what she did, other than build a theatre, or why that mattered. But even though she left New York City in the end, she still gained an international reputation. Elsewhere, perhaps, there's more recognition of the breadth of her vision, the scale of her ambition and daring, the magnitude of the task she took on. She was awarded the Order of the British Empire, hailed throughout the region and beyond as the woman who started the movement to preserve Caribbean folk dance and to make known the importance of Africa to dance throughout the Americas. And, of course, almost 100 years after she took her first classes there, she is also, I'm happy to say, still remembered at Columbia Teachers College.
Hello, I'm Dr. Barbara Bashaw, Executive Director and Arnhold Professor of Practice here in the Dance Education Program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Judy, thank you so much for that evocative and eloquent talk about our cherished alumna, Beryl McBurnie. It's such an honor to have you here with us tonight for our Q&A session with several of our doctoral students. So I will pose the first question for you on behalf of our doctoral student, Katrina Brown-Aliffi, who could not be here this evening. Katrina asks the following: biographical research seems so personal and intimate, and the level of detail that you've been able to gather about Beryl McBurnie's life is incredible. As you were in the throes of your data collection process, were there any pivotal moments that led to your most significant discoveries?
Well, thanks for that very interesting and, in fact, flattering question. And let me just make it clear from the start that I am a mere writer of lives. I'm not a dancer or expert in dance in any way whatsoever. I write about people, mostly women, who are involved in the arts. And also I wrote down some answers so that I wouldn't leave out anything important. So yes, biographical research can indeed be very personal and intimate, but in many respects it was less so in Beryl McBurnie's case than in at least 2 of the other books I've written about women who are still alive, and also journalistic pieces I've written. In Beryl's case, I was told and read much more about her public persona. I personally interviewed her over 20 years ago when she was already an old lady, and I interviewed her, so a lot of people who knew her, but they were her dancers or a friend from her old age who was much younger than her. She died 20 years ago, and there's no one left who was her friend from when she was young, obviously. And even if any of her contemporaries were alive, I suspect they would be a lot more reticent about certain subjects in younger people. So all of those affected the information I was able to get about her. In addition, the focus of the book was really on Beryl's work. So what I wrote about her as a person was really to illustrate how her character affected what she was able to achieve as a dancer, choreographer, founder of the Little Carib Theatre. The National Heritage Library here allowed me to go through over 30 boxes of her books and papers, but she never really wrote very much at all. She may have written some letters to friends, but of course those friends would be dead, and no one retrieved those letters before she or they died. My father and his siblings knew her, actually. They came from roughly the same era and the same social class. They were Port of Spain Creole people, that is, of mixed African and European descent. So what I knew of their lives also colored what I wrote about her. But unfortunately, they are no longer with us either. One of my aunts, many years ago, told me she actually danced briefly with Beryl, and I so wish I'd spoken to her more about it at the time. And then later, I discovered they had actually also been very close friends. But by that time, my aunt was not in a state to be able to talk about that kind of thing. So it may be rather disappointing, but the single most important new thing that I discovered about her that nobody had known up till then was her exact age, which she never told anybody. In those days, one didn't ask a lady her age, and it was even wrong on the program at her funeral. But I did, in the end, get it by the simple, though time-consuming measure of going to the registry and asking for a copy of her birth certificate. And that was how I found out she was born in 1913.
Thank you so much for that answer. And it does really press how important it is to, to try to preserve things and archive things while we can.
And how easily they're lost.
How easily it's lost. And it's also just really amazing that you have a family connection as well. So that was really, really fascinating to hear. So our next question is from doctoral student Melissa Van Wijk.
Hi, Judy. Thank you for answering my questions. It's such a pleasure. My first question is, what was the point of view McBurnie had on the value and importance of dance of the quote unquote common man and folk art? And what were the arguments she made in favor of those types of dance against those from the Harlem Renaissance who favored quote unquote high culture?
Well, as I've said, she never really wrote very much, but in answer to the first part of your question, I can quote from a summary of what was described as a lecture that Beryl McBurnie gave at a symposium at the University of the West Indies on the artist in West Indian society, which was probably in the late 1950s or early 1960s. There's a note to the text of her lecture that explains that much of her time was actually taken up not with talking, but with demonstrations of different kinds of dance and music. And even so, the transcript, which was done by somebody else, is only 4 pages long. But after summarizing the influences on West Indian dance, European, i.e. mostly Scots, Irish, French, English, and possibly even Portuguese, as well as African and Indian, Beryl McBurnie said, West Indians must continue to draw on the manifold cultural influences that have gone into our historical and cultural makeup and to reinterpret them in the light of our own experiences. In this way, we can make a worthwhile contribution to a West Indian way of life. Our aim should be towards creating and maintaining a universal standard. We must ensure that the artistic quality of West Indian people should be of such a quality and caliber that it will flow naturally into the broad stream of universal culture, expressive of the common humanity of our own world. So she saw West Indian dance and culture as both unique and a unifying force among peoples both within and beyond the Caribbean. And the person who summarized what she said added, in answer to questions at the end of her lecture, Miss McBurney said that in her view, dance was the most significant West Indian art form since it contained the greatest variety of raw material, ready to hand, waiting to be worked on and presented. When I talked to her about her work in West Indian dance, she said, as I quoted in the book, "I'm very interested in the classics. Nothing can be more beautiful than Tristan und Isolde, nothing. But you can't give a little girl an aria from the Meister singers to sing in a competition for her country when there's a gallery of folk songs or even calypso, can you?" So I hope those comments add up to some kind of answer to your question. As I have said, she really wasn't given to writing or theorizing. I think she had a sort of impulsive, intuitive mind. So there isn't anywhere that Beryl McBurney laid out a philosophy in writing. You have to kind of extrapolate it from what she actually did and from snippets of what she said.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And then my next question is, did Beryl and her dancers see their work or themselves as political at that time? And if so, what did they see as their political motive or goals?
Well, Beryl was not consciously at all political in any sense, despite her numerous friends who were actively involved in mainstream politics. In a television interview in, I think, the late 1970s or early 80s, when she was asked about her work, she looked back at her own school days and her early days teaching dance in schools. And she said, "We would be dancing nothing Trinidadian, nothing West Indian. The colored child in dance or theater was never really thought about, and something had to be done. What happened with me, it emerged really. I didn't set out to make a political question of it. It just happened naturally." But of course, even if it wasn't consciously political, Beryl did have political connections and the vision of a dedicated theatre for folk dance. And she felt Caribbean governments should step in and support the efforts of organizations like Her Little Carib and the equivalents that sprang up around the region as a result of her work. Some of her dancers may have shared that idea, but a lot of them were simply young people who were literally roped in by Beryl, more or less at random. A lot of them didn't even know that they had any dance talent or wanted to be dancers until she dragged them into the theatre physically. And they would have enjoyed the experience. They got to perform, they got to go on tour sometimes and so on. But I think in a lot of cases, it might not have been until they were quite a lot older that they realized that they and the Little Carib were cultural pioneers and the real significance of what it was they were doing during those years.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Judy. Finally, I would like to introduce you to doctoral student, Shola Roberts.
Hi, Judy.
Hi.
My TC community. It is an extreme honor to be in your presence tonight, and I am grateful for this opportunity. Judy, you referenced the extensive network of individuals that McBurney was in constant communication with in Trinidad and New York City, like Eric Williams, CLR James, and Andrew Carr, to name a few. I am a firm believer in being in alignment with like-minded individuals to push an agenda that may seem radical to the majority. Do you see the same kind of support, acknowledgement, and honoring continuing in this present time for those artists that continue to live, breathe, study, and teach these dance forms?
The short answer is yes and no. The landscape of dance has changed a lot since Beryl's day. There are a lot more dance companies, but then a lot of them struggle more or less as much as Beryl's own company did. There is a more general acceptance of the value of her work and those who continue to do work in that vein. There is in Trinidad an organized Prime Minister's Best Village competition in which local communities get together and compete, and through which dance and other folk cultural forms are preserved. And that is lively. It involves a lot of people. A lot of people watch it even if they don't take part in it. And that is supported by the government. Beryl personally, I think, was bitterly disappointed by the lack of concrete financial support from her friends in high places like Eric Williams, who was personally generous, but whose government didn't do a lot to help her and her Little Carib Theatre. And she felt she should have been put in charge of the Best Village program, which would probably actually have been fairly disastrous because long-term planning and organization were really not her strong point. And that position went to the Prime Minister's sister-in-law instead. As I said, there are a number of dance companies active now, some of which teach not only dance of African, but also Indian origin, and several others that work in contemporary Caribbean dance and have their roots in folk dance of African origin, but they don't get any government support. One dancer in particular, Noble Douglas, who strangely enough never worked with Beryl, but who shared with her that they both had training in the Martha Graham method. Noble has had a company for many years, although it rarely performs now. And of course, eventually she had to move on to choreography rather than performing. She's in her 70s now. She's not publicly given the same kind of credit for her work as Beryl, because Beryl was the first. But Noble has been able to do two things that Beryl couldn't. One is to set up a company that lasted for decades and branched into a number of other companies. And also Noble Douglas set up the Lilliput Theatre, which trains not only young dancers, but also actors and other theatre practitioners from childhood, some of whom are still working here and some of whom have gone on to have very successful international careers. And I think, unlike Beryl's Little Carib company, Noble's work will endure more obviously through the people that she's trained and mentored. But again, like most of the other companies here, Noble has never really received the recognition or the financial and other kinds of support that she really deserves, sadly.
Thank you for that. My second question, as someone who would like to follow in Mama McBurnie's fearless footsteps, how might I use her framework of preservation to archive the cultural practices of other small islands like my beautiful Grenada?
Well, I think in this case, I can give a much more optimistic answer, I'm happy to say. I think people following in Beryl's footsteps today are in many ways in a better position than her, because they don't have to persuade people that this work is a worthwhile enterprise, even if that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get very much funding. But there is more appreciation of the importance of Caribbean folk heritage and more groups doing the work. So that makes it easier. You don't have to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch. One mixed blessing is that a lot of governments, I think probably including the government of Grenada, see dance and related carnival traditions as tourist attractions. I mean, in our new government, this is since September, the Minister for the Arts and Culture has tourism as the first and presumably hence the most important item in his portfolio. So that's how governments regard many of the performing arts, in light of their usefulness as a means of generating income. But it also means that there are more performances and more accessible performances, even if some of them are in hotels rather than being held within communities for the specific occasions they were originally meant for. And some of them may have been jazzed up, so to speak, or watered down, depending on how you look at it, for audiences of overseas visitors. Another advantage that we have today, of course, is that it's so much easier to record these traditions visually, or anyone with a smartphone can record both the music and the dance at some level, or people talking about what it was like when they were young, what dances were done in those days that aren't performed anymore. And there are more, like yourself, academically, formally trained dancers who are better equipped to archive and record them in various ways. I mean, Beryl's dances, there's very little video footage of anything that she did, and one or two that she recorded are not in any kind of formal notation. So how useful they are to actual dancers trying to recreate them is fairly dubious. But because of the general increased awareness of the importance of these traditions and maintaining them, I think, for instance, if you were to go into small communities and ask people if there are any dances local to that area, you would get more understanding of why you're doing this work, what it is you're trying to do, and probably more willingness to cooperate and to help you and to explain to you what this means and this is how we do it and so on.
Thank you so much for your response, Judy.
You're most welcome.
And thank you, Shola. So that wraps up our Q&A session with author and scholar Judy Raymond. Judy's book about Beryl McBurney is available in our virtual bookstore, accessible from the symposium webpage. Judy, once again, we are so honored that you could be a part of our very first Arnhold Institute symposium. A heartfelt thanks, especially for sharing.
My pleasure. I just wish I could have been there physically, but
we do too.
Yeah.
We just thank you so much for sharing Beryl McBurney with our community. She will continue. She will be someone that we continue to celebrate her and her legacy here at Teachers College. Thank you so much.